In the year 1602, something extraordinary took shape in the Dutch Republic. Not a kingdom. Not an empire. A company. But this was no ordinary company, assembled merely to buy and sell in the traffic of everyday commerce. This was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, a machine of capital, cannon, secrecy, and state power. A corporation with the right to wage war, seize ships, negotiate treaties, build forts, govern territory, and mint money. In the long history of human ambition, that was not a footnote. That was a rupture. Professor Adrian Lockwell has spent a lifetime studying the moments when institutions stop behaving like institutions and begin behaving like instruments of power. The VOC is one of those moments. It stands at the meeting point of merchant ambition, national survival, and imperial violence. It was born in accounting houses and dockyards, but it quickly learned to speak the language of fleets, fortresses, and coerced obedience. To understand the VOC, history must first be stripped of its polite disguises. Trade was never merely trade. In the early modern world, trade was strategy. Spice routes were supply lines. Ports were political prizes. Credit was leverage. Information was a weapon. And monopoly, that most seductive promise of all, was never just about profit. It was about domination. The Dutch understood this with ruthless clarity because they had been forced to. Their republic was young, defiant, and still fighting for survival against the Spanish Empire. It was a state forged in revolt, too small to win by brute force, too clever to survive without organization. Across Europe, Dutch merchants were already reaching into Asian waters, chasing pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon goods that connected the distant islands of the East to the fiscal survival of a European republic. Yet there was a problem. The Dutch were competing not only against Iberian rivals, but against one another. Separate merchant ventures, jealous and fragmented, undercut each other's returns and weakened the very leverage they hoped to build. Every expedition carried the same brutal logic: if capital was divided, power was divided; if power was divided, the Portuguese and Spanish could exploit the cracks. The market, left to itself, could become an instrument of weakness. So in 1602, the States General did something audacious. It unified those competing ventures into a single chartered enterprise, one vast institution designed to concentrate money, authority, and violence under one banner. This was not merely a consolidation of business. It was a political invention. The Dutch Republic had created a tool that could operate beyond the horizon as an extension of itself. And there, in that transformation, lies the central paradox. The VOC was a commercial enterprise, yes, but it was also authorized to act like a sovereign. It could command armed fleets. It could seize enemy shipping. It could strike bargains with Asian rulers. It could establish fortified stations, administer territory, and impose its will far from Europe's legal gaze. In effect, the company became a state within a state, or perhaps more accurately, a state outsourced to merchants. That is why the VOC matters. Not because it sold spices. Many did that. Not because it grew rich. Many tried. The VOC mattered because it revealed a terrifying truth about modern power: when a society fuses finance with force, profit can become policy, and policy can become war. The men who built the VOC did not see themselves as villains in a morality play. They saw danger. They saw competition. They saw the fierce arithmetic of a world in which distant markets could determine whether a republic survived or collapsed. Their logic was not irrational, it was disciplined. But history is full of disciplined minds walking straight into moral catastrophe. The most dangerous systems are often the ones that begin as elegant solutions. So this story is not simply about a company. It is about the architecture of an age in which Europe's states, merchants, and navies were all learning the same lesson: whoever controlled trade routes could shape politics, and whoever controlled violence could control trade. The VOC was where those lessons hardened into institution. And once an institution is built to reward aggression, secrecy, and expansion, it rarely remains content with balance. It begins to hunger. It begins to justify itself. It begins to confuse success with righteousness. That is how a company can start to resemble an empire, and an empire can hide behind a ledger. The mystery, then, is not why the VOC became powerful. The mystery is why a republic under threat would trust merchants with the instruments of war. The answer lies in the great pressure of the early 17th century, a world of imperial rivalry, maritime choke points, and strategic commodities that could move the fortunes of states. To understand that pressure, the map itself must be widened. Because the VOC did not emerge from calm waters. It emerged from a world already in motion, a world where Iberian monopolies were being challenged, where Asian spice networks sat at the center of global wealth, and where the Dutch Republic had decided that survival required more than courage. It required an institution built for competition at the edge of the world. And that is where the real story begins. By 1602, the Dutch Republic had already absorbed a lesson carved by war. In a world ruled by empires, scattered merchants were prey. The struggle against Spain was not merely a revolt, it was an endurance test against a far larger machine of power, credit, and coercion. The Dutch did not face an opponent that could be beaten by courage alone. They faced a system. And systems do not collapse because a few men wish them away. They collapse when another system becomes strong enough to outlast them. That is why survival and commerce began to merge into the same question. If the Dutch were to resist Spain, they could not remain a loose constellation of city-based ventures, each investor chasing private gain, each captain guarding his own opportunity, each port acting as if the war were someone else's problem. Fragmentation was not a harmless inconvenience. It was a strategic weakness. Every divided effort lowered prices, duplicated risk, and handed leverage to rivals who understood something the Dutch were only beginning to accept: in global struggle, unity is a weapon. Beyond Europe, the center of gravity of wealth was shifting. For generations, Iberian powers had behaved as though the routes to Asia were a private inheritance, as though the spice trade could be enclosed, taxed, and guarded like a fortress gate. That illusion was breaking. The Asian spice economy was not waiting for Europe to invent it. It already existed as a dense and ancient network of producers, middlemen, island polities, coastal traders, and long-distance brokers. Cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and mace moved through that world long before they arrived in Europe, where they became symbols of status, profit, and state power. The Europeans arrived late, but they arrived with a dangerous new idea, that oceanic commerce could be seized and militarized. This is where the significance of 1602 becomes unmistakable. The Dutch were not entering a peaceful market. They were entering a contest of logistics, finance, and force. Portuguese competition still pressed on the spice routes. Dutch maritime ambition was rising. And all around the Republic, the realities of empire were becoming impossible to ignore. Ships had to be financed months before profit could appear. Convoys had to be arranged because isolated cargoes were easy prey. Credit had to be extended across vast distances, while insurance had to absorb the ever-present possibility of capture, wreck, or delay. Information became a form of power, because whoever learned first could buy cheaper, sail faster, and strike harder. In the 17th century, the real battlefield was not only the sea. It was the network that made the sea usable. The Dutch understood, with increasing clarity, that the spice trade was not a trivial luxury business. Spices were strategic commodities. They enriched merchants, but they also stabilized treasuries, sustained cities, and helped underwrite the fiscal survival of states still locked in continental war. A spice route was not just a route for flavor. It was a corridor of revenue. It was a channel through which power moved. Whoever controlled that corridor gained more than merchandise, they gained a lever over politics itself. For the Dutch Republic, this was not an abstract theory. Independence from Spain still had to be paid for, defended, and outlasted. That meant maritime strength was not ornamental. It was the foundation of national survival. The same commercial energies that might enrich private men also carried the burden of sustaining a republic under siege. In that environment, trade ceased to be a separate sphere. It became a weapon of statecraft. A merchant voyage could contribute to victory, or it could weaken the republic by scattering its resources in useless competition. And that is why the old pattern could not continue. Rival Dutch merchants were not simply business competitors, they were strategic liabilities to one another. They undercut prices, duplicated voyages, and weakened the bargaining position of the republic abroad. Every company acting alone faced the same brutal reality: the Asian theater was too expensive, too distant, and too contested to be mastered by improvisation. Private ambition, left unmanaged, became self-defeating. The sea rewarded scale. The spice trade rewarded coordination. The age rewarded the power to combine money with force. So the question in 1602 was not whether the Dutch should trade with Asia. They already were. The question was how to stop their own merchants from sabotaging one another while competing against Portuguese and other European rivals overseas. The answer was radical because the problem was radical. The Republic needed a single institution capable of gathering fragmented capital, standardizing command, and presenting one unified face to the world. Separate ventures had produced movement, but not strategic depth. What was required now was consolidation, one body, one policy, one pressure point against the global rivals of the Dutch state. That decision revealed a hard truth about early modern power. Commercial societies often like to imagine that profit and politics occupy separate worlds. In reality, the two were already entangled. The moment a republic depended on maritime wealth for survival, every trade route became political terrain. Every loss at sea carried diplomatic consequences. Every advantage in Asia fed directly into Europe's balance of power. The Dutch did not create this reality. They adapted to it. And because they adapted faster than their rivals, they were able to turn necessity into architecture. The Portuguese had already shown that trade could be tied to cannon. The Dutch would go further. They would seek not merely to participate in the spice economy, but to command it. That required patience, secrecy, discipline, and above all coordination. It required a legal form strong enough to gather capital from many investors while acting as a single geopolitical force overseas. It required an institution that could blur the line between merchant and state, between ledger and arsenal, between profit and policy. This is why the VOC mattered from the beginning. It did not emerge as a modest merchant association in the later modern sense of a business seeking orderly returns. It emerged as an answer to imperial pressure. The Republic had been cornered by a world in which markets were already contested territory. So it built a company capable of surviving the contest. Not because trade had become peaceful, but because trade had become war by other means. The deeper irony is that commerce was supposed to civilize competition. Instead, competition had infected commerce with the logic of siege. Once the Dutch saw that clearly, the next step became almost inevitable. If a company could be made large enough, coordinated enough, and ruthless enough, then it could do more than buy and sell. It could negotiate, fortify, police, and govern. It could become the political arm of commercial ambition. That was the leap of 1602, not merely a corporate charter, but the beginning of a new kind of power. And that is where the story tightens. The legal architecture would matter. The capital would matter. The routes, the insurance systems, the intelligence networks, the convoys, the chambers, the shipping schedules, all of it would have to be fused into one imperial machine. Because once the Dutch entered the Asian arena, they were no longer just merchants chasing returns. They were actors in a struggle over sovereignty itself. The charter was not the destination. It was the response to a world that had made ordinary commerce too weak for survival. The next step was to turn that pressure into law, and that law into power. The VOC did not begin as a shipowners' club or a mere warehouse consortium. It emerged as an instrument of statecraft, forged in a world where commerce and war had ceased to be opposites. In 1602, the States General of the Dutch Republic granted a remarkable charter to a single unified company, one designed to do what scattered merchants could not. It could raise capital, but it could also wield cannon. It could buy pepper, but it could also seize ports. It could negotiate, fortify, administer, and even mint money. That charter was not a decorative legal document. It was a transfer of sovereign functions. In one stroke, the Dutch Republic handed private investors the powers of war, treaties, forts, coinage, and governance because the Republic itself was trapped in a struggle for survival. The Dutch were fighting Spain, battling for independence, and competing in a global economy where the routes to Asian spices were becoming routes to power. The old separation between merchant and prince no longer held. Whoever controlled trade lanes controlled revenue, whoever controlled revenue could sustain fleets, whoever sustained fleets could dictate terms. This is the first great secret of the VOC, it was not simply funded by trade. It was designed to convert trade into permanent strategic leverage. The genius, and the danger, lay in the way capital was organized. Before the VOC, Dutch merchants had already been venturing into Asian waters, but they were fragmented, competing against one another, driving prices down, and weakening their own position abroad. Profit was being destroyed by rivalry at home. So the Republic forced consolidation. Investors pooled their money through shares, creating a durable financial machine able to survive long voyages, ship losses, military setbacks, and years of delay between investment and return. This was no ordinary partnership where one wrecked fleet meant ruin. The VOC spread risk across many backers, turning a fragile commercial gamble into a lasting institution. That mattered because the Asian trade was not a quick market. It was a chessboard of distance, intelligence, and patience. A voyage could take months. A battle could erase a year's profit. A single monopoly route could decide whether an entire chamber of the company thrived or collapsed. In that environment, finance became a strategic weapon. Capital was not sitting idle in ledgers, it was being assembled into hulls, convoys, warehouses, intelligence networks, diplomatic missions, and armed enforcement. The company's internal structure reflected the same tension between local profit and imperial ambition. The VOC was divided among regional chambers in Dutch cities, each with its own merchants, sponsors, and interests. Yet over all of them sat a central logic: the company had to behave like a state in Asia if it wanted to remain profitable in Europe. That created a permanent friction. Local investors wanted dividends. Company governors wanted control. Sailors wanted pay. Soldiers wanted protection. The directors wanted monopoly. The Republic wanted strategic advantage. The entire institution became a negotiation between greed and empire. And nowhere was that negotiation more visible than in Batavia, founded in 1619. Batavia became the Asian command center, the nerve node of a commercial empire that had learned to think like a fortress. Here, the VOC concentrated administration, warehouses, ship repair, intelligence gathering, and coercion. From Batavia, orders could be issued across the archipelago, cargo could be stored, redirected, or withheld, envoys could be received, enemies could be watched, and local rulers could be pressured into compliance. Batavia was not merely a city. It was an operating system for domination. The company's power rested on a hard truth: monopoly is never maintained by market behavior alone. It must be enforced. So the VOC kept a private army. It built fortified ports. It made treaties. It threatened rivals. It could project force where a normal merchant would have been helpless. This was the crucial transformation. The company did not leave violence behind when it entered the marketplace, it carried violence with it and gave violence an accountant's discipline. The charter powers made that possible in legal form, but the real revolution was psychological. The VOC taught its managers to think of coercion as a business tool. A port was not just a harbor, it was leverage. A treaty was not just diplomacy, it was a contract secured by threat. A fort was not merely defense, it was a choke point in the movement of goods. Coinage was not just money, it was legitimacy stamped in metal. Governance was not just administration, it was the quiet conquest of everyday life. In that sense, the VOC was one of history's great alchemical engines. It took merchant wealth and transmuted it into territorial authority. It took private capital and wrapped it in public power. It took the language of commerce and taught it to speak with the accent of empire. The result was a hybrid creature, part corporation, part fleet, part army, part government, built to dominate a world where the richest prizes could not be won by commerce alone. Yet this architecture was always unstable, because every part of it pulled in a different direction. Investors wanted returns. Administrators wanted control. Governors in Asia needed autonomy to act quickly. Directors in the Netherlands wanted oversight. Soldiers created costs. Forts required garrisons. Treaties created obligations. Intelligence invited suspicion. And beneath all of it was the oldest problem in history: once an institution learns that force can protect profit, it usually forgets where profit ends and force begins. That is why the VOC matters beyond its own century. It was not just a company with weapons. It was a machine for converting finance into sovereignty, and sovereignty into more finance. A circular logic of power. A state within a state. A ledger backed by cannon. And once that machine was running, the next question was no longer whether it would use violence, but how far it would go when violence became the shortest road to monopoly. The answer to that question would be written in blood, on distant islands where cloves, nutmeg, and the hard mathematics of profit would collide. The architecture was complete. Now it would be tested. And so the VOC's true nature was revealed not in boardrooms, but in the Banda Islands, an archipelago where a tiny nutmeg harvest carried the value of empire, and where monopoly mattered more than mercy. In Europe, trade was often described as civilized exchange, a neat balance of supply and demand. But the early modern world was never governed by neatness. It was governed by choke points, convoy routes, warehouse control, and the power to deny rivals access to the market. Whoever controlled those nodes controlled prices, and whoever controlled prices controlled states. Nutmeg was not merely a luxury spice. It was strategic wealth. It was leverage. It was fiscal oxygen for a republic still fighting for its survival. Yet a monopoly never survives on paper alone. The moment the VOC discovered that profit could be increased by excluding rivals rather than merely outcompeting them, commerce changed its language and became war. Portuguese traders, English ventures, and local rulers all encountered the same brutal reality: the company did not arrive as a merchant and later become violent. It arrived already organized for coercion. Forts rose where warehouses might have stood. Cannons guarded ledgers. Treaties were written under the shadow of naval force. The market was not free, it was being engineered. This was the decisive transformation of the age, capital learning that it could hire violence, and violence learning that it could be defended as accounting. The VOC did not simply want entry into the spice trade. It wanted exclusivity, stable prices, and the power to turn a scattered archipelago of producers into a controlled supply chain feeding Dutch profit. That required breaking native autonomy, because local choice is the enemy of monopoly. The Banda people had their own traders, their own alliances, and their own place in the Indian Ocean economy. They were not empty territory waiting to be claimed. They were participants in a system the VOC intended to dismantle. Into that world stepped Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the company's most infamous strategist, and one of the clearest examples of what happens when certainty is fused to power. Cohen believed hesitation invited competition, compromise diluted monopoly, and mercy could be mistaken for weakness. In his mind, greatness required command, not negotiation. He was not a pirate improvising brutality for loot. He was an imperial manager applying force to an economic equation. That is what makes him so revealing. Cohen exposes the cold logic beneath the polite vocabulary of commerce. The Banda campaign showed what that logic meant in practice. The VOC moved to crush resistance, seize territory, and impose a new order over nutmeg production. When the Banda Islands refused to submit easily, the company answered with military conquest, terror, forced relocation, and coerced labor. Native populations were killed, expelled, or reduced to dependence under a regime built for Dutch profit. This was not a side effect of trade. It was trade's coercive core brought into the open. The monopoly price in Amsterdam had a hidden cost in Banda, and that cost was paid in shattered communities. There is a temptation, especially in older histories, to treat such violence as the rough edge of a supposedly progressive age, a grim necessity on the road to modern capitalism. But that reading is too clean. It protects the system by blaming the excess. The VOC's violence was not a departure from economic rationality. It was economic rationality stripped of its mask. A monopoly cannot survive where producers can sell to rivals. A monopoly cannot preserve high prices where alternatives remain open. So the company used force to close those alternatives. It used intelligence to track competitors, diplomacy to isolate enemies, and naval power to make refusal unbearable. Every instrument served the same end, control. And the world around the VOC was never a simple duel between Europeans and Asians. It was a violent multipolar arena, crowded with Portuguese garrisons, English ventures, local rulers, brokers, interpreters, and shifting alliances. Here, the company's genius and its corruption were inseparable. It learned to read weakness, exploit division, and bargain when bargaining served conquest. It cultivated informants and middlemen. It gathered intelligence not for curiosity, but for advantage. It made treaties not because it respected sovereignty, but because treaties could stabilize theft. Soft power and hard power were not opposites. They were alternating tools in the same hand. That is why the VOC matters so much historically. It was not merely a merchant enterprise with armed escorts. It was a prototype of organized coercion under commercial cover. The company could negotiate one day and bombard the next. It could promise stability while preparing siege. It could speak the language of lawful trade while enforcing monopoly through fear. That blend, accounting books and artillery, shares and seizures, contracts and conquest, made the VOC one of the most potent institutions of its age. It also made it dangerous, because once a company learns that violence increases margins, restraint begins to look like weakness. And yet, for a brief and terrible moment, the system appeared to work. The Dutch secured positions. Rivals were pushed back. Trade routes were redirected. Profit arrived with the cold efficiency of a successful campaign. From Amsterdam, the model could look almost elegant: pool capital, project force, control supply, raise value. But beneath that triumph lay a deeper instability. Every conquered port demanded garrisons. Every enforced monopoly bred resentment. Every victory tightened the company's dependence on coercion. The VOC was winning in ways that could not be morally sanitized or politically sustained. Success was becoming a trap. For empire built on commerce faces a brutal contradiction: trade depends on exchange, while monopoly depends on denial. To dominate a market, the VOC had to suppress the very fluidity that made trade profitable in the first place. It had to turn mobility into obstruction and abundance into scarcity. That is the hidden violence of monopoly. It does not merely take a share. It reshapes the entire world so that only one hand may collect the harvest. Bonda was the proof. Cohen was the executor. And the company's charter was the alibi. By the time the smoke cleared, the VOC had revealed the full anatomy of its power. Commerce had become policy, policy had become conquest, and conquest had become routine. The company had crossed the threshold from market actor to sovereign enforcer, and there was no easy way back. The same machine built to defend Dutch survival was now teaching the age a harsher lesson: when profit is protected by cannon, every balance sheet contains a battlefield. And that is where the story turns from immediate victory into long shadow, because once a corporation learns to rule by force, it rarely stops at the first monopoly. It searches for the next one, and then the next. The VOC's appetite for control would drag it deeper into war, administration, and overreach, until the very scale of its success began to threaten the structure that had made it possible. By the time a company begins to behave like a state, its victory is already carrying the seed of its ruin. The VOC did not merely sell spices, it inherited ports, coerced local rulers, maintained garrisons, administered courts, and taxed the very routes it claimed to liberate from Portuguese control. What had begun in 1602 as a brilliant answer to Dutch rivalry hardened into something far more difficult to govern, an empire whose bookkeeping had to explain cannons, and whose cannons had to protect bookkeeping. That was the company's great strategic miracle, and its fatal compromise. Profit no longer came only from buying low and selling high. It came from controlling choke points, enforcing monopolies, and demanding obedience across a widening Asian network. Batavia became the company's command center not simply because it was a warehouse city, but because it allowed the VOC to think like an empire, centralize authority, oversee warehouses and shipyards, collect intelligence, coordinate fleets, and move violence where the market would not cooperate. Yet the more it expanded, the less it resembled a flexible merchant venture. It became heavier, slower, more bureaucratic, and more dependent on force to preserve the profits that force itself was consuming. This is the ancient logic of overextension in modern clothing. Every monopoly creates resistance. Every fortified trade route requires soldiers. Every soldier requires pay. Every paymaster requires accounting. Every account creates pressure to preserve dividends. And once dividends become politically sacred, truth begins to suffer. Officials manipulate reports. Governors conceal losses. Success is exaggerated in Amsterdam while the margins in Asia are thinned by garrisons, corruption, smuggling, and the endless cost of holding territory that never fully belonged to the company in the first place. The VOC's internal structure made that decay almost inevitable. Its chambers in the Dutch Republic were designed to pool capital and spread risk, but that same design also scattered responsibility. No single hand felt the full consequence of a bad war, a failed harvest, a reckless expedition, or a corrupt administrator on the far side of the world. Distance protected decision-makers from the ugliness of their own system. It is one of history's most durable temptations: when an institution becomes too large, accountability becomes theoretical. The ledger still balances on paper long after the moral arithmetic has collapsed. And the world around the VOC did not stand still. The company's first generation had benefited from a moment of Dutch ascendancy, when Iberian monopoly looked vulnerable and the Republic's maritime energy seemed to offer a new order in Asian trade. But empire is never a static prize. Rivals learn. Routes shift. Local rulers adapt. British and French competition sharpened. Asian markets changed. Consumer tastes evolved. The once golden spice trade no longer guaranteed the same margins, while the costs of holding the system rose relentlessly. A corporation built for conquest found itself trapped in maintenance. Then came the wars with England, the brutal contests of the 17th and 18th centuries that revealed the true hierarchy of power. Private trade networks could raid, maneuver, and bargain, but only state-backed rivals could absorb prolonged naval war at scale. Here the VOC's deep contradiction was exposed. It had been granted quasi-sovereign powers to act like a state, yet it lacked the unlimited fiscal backing of a real state. In peacetime, that ambiguity was an advantage. In wartime, it became a trap. The company was expected to perform imperial functions without the infinite credit, political legitimacy, or national unity that sustained actual empires. And so the company was squeezed from both directions. From below, corruption and local resistance eroded its authority. From above, investors demanded returns that the machinery of conquest could no longer reliably produce. The VOC became a victim of its own success. The more territory and obligation it accumulated, the less elegant its original commercial model became. It had traded the nimble uncertainty of commerce for the grim burden of administration. It had converted opportunistic trade into an institutional appetite for coercion. And coercion, once normalized, is never cheap. By the late 18th century, the company's decline was no longer a rumor but a structure. Debt multiplied. Administrative inertia deepened. Military commitments became harder to sustain. The old miracle of 17th-century maritime entrepreneurship had ossified into a financial machine that could not outpace its own liabilities. In 1799, the VOC was dissolved after bankruptcy, and its assets and obligations passed to the Dutch state. The corporation that had once acted like a sovereign was finally absorbed by sovereignty itself. The private empire did not vanish into thin air, it was inherited, itemized, and nationalized. That is the uncomfortable irony at the heart of the story. The VOC did not fail because power was absent. It failed because power was too concentrated, too lucrative, and too poorly restrained. It revealed that when commerce is fused with violence, the short-term logic of conquest can outperform the long-term logic of stewardship. A company may seize territory faster than it can govern it. It may crush competition faster than it can build legitimacy. It may generate wealth faster than it can preserve honesty. But eventually the hidden costs arrive. They arrive in debt, in corruption, in rebellion, in strategic exhaustion, and in the quiet realization that the system was feeding on the very foundations it claimed to defend. The VOC is therefore more than a story about an old trading company. It is an early blueprint for a recurring modern danger, institutions that concentrate economic influence, political leverage, and logistical control while escaping the scrutiny that normally disciplines power. The names change. The architecture remains hauntingly familiar. A supply chain becomes a weapon. A balance sheet becomes a policy instrument. A private interest begins to shape public outcomes. And somewhere beneath the efficiency and the language of necessity, the oldest human pattern reappears, ambition persuading itself that scale is the same thing as wisdom. History rarely punishes greed with immediate collapse. It punishes it with momentum. The VOC survived long enough to believe its own myth. That is why its ending matters. Not because it was uniquely wicked, but because it was so structurally modern: capital seeking security, security demanding force, force demanding administration, and administration slowly consuming the original purpose. The company became a state, and in becoming one, it inherited the oldest burden in politics: accountability to consequences it could no longer easily deny. And that is the shadow it casts across the centuries. Whenever power is allowed to move faster than restraint, the future begins to look like an invoice written in blood, debt, and silence. In the end, the Dutch East India Company did not merely sell pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and silk. It sold a new idea of power. A ledger could become a fort. A shareholder meeting could become a war council. A seal on parchment could become authority over ships, ports, treaties, and armed men. The VOC was the first megacorporation not because it was large, but because it fused capital, coercion, and governance into a single machine. That fusion was its genius. It was also its original sin. For a time, the system worked with terrifying efficiency. Money raised in Amsterdam became cannon in the Indian Ocean. Information gathered in distant waters became commercial advantage at home. Violence, bureaucracy, and finance were no longer separate worlds, they were parts of one strategic design. And that is why the VOC mattered so deeply. It was not an anomaly floating above history. It was history revealing a pattern that would return again and again. When institutions are rewarded for expansion faster than they are restrained by conscience, they begin to behave like states without the burden of legitimacy. The company's collapse in 1799 did not erase that lesson. It sharpened it. Because the VOC did not simply die of old age. It was consumed by the very logic that made it powerful: overreach, corruption, mounting costs, and the hard mathematics of monopoly under pressure. Once the appetite for profit outran the discipline of governance, the machine began to eat itself. This is the ancient rhythm of concentrated power. The more total the control, the more catastrophic the failure when control slips. And that is the modern mirror. The names change. The flags change. The language changes. But the architecture remains unsettlingly familiar. Networks of finance can shape policy. Supply chains can influence nations. Private institutions can accumulate reach so vast that they begin to resemble sovereign actors, while accountability lags behind ambition. The VOC reminds the modern world that power does not always arrive with a crown or a uniform. Sometimes it arrives with investors, contracts, and the calm language of efficiency. That is what makes its story so enduring, and so dangerous. The company exposed a truth that civilizations prefer not to face: legitimacy is fragile when profit becomes the highest law. A system may expand brilliantly for decades while quietly hollowing out the moral ground beneath it. Then, when pressure finally arrives, the collapse is not only financial. It is political, strategic, and human. In the final balance sheet, the VOC left behind more than cargo, ruins, and archives. It left behind a template. A template for how capital can organize violence. A template for how ambition can disguise itself as order. A template for how a society, intoxicated by success, can mistake domination for stability. And so the deepest lesson of the VOC is not that corporations can become powerful. That has been known ever since. The deeper and more unsettling lesson is that power, once unmoored from restraint, will always search for new instruments: law, finance, secrecy, force, to justify its own expansion. The company did not invent this instinct. It perfected it. That is why the VOC still matters. Not as a relic, but as a warning etched into the long memory of history. Whenever institutions grow larger than the ethics that contain them, the old ghost returns: profit without conscience, efficiency without mercy, authority without consent. If this kind of historical deep dive belongs on the regular watch list, subscribe for more grand stories that reveal how power really works, and check the next video on the end screen, because the same machinery of ambition has appeared in far more places than most histories admit. In the comments, leave one word: legitimacy or monopoly. History keeps forcing that choice, and the answer determines whether power serves society, or consumes it. And history, ruthless as ever, asks the same question in every age: when power learns to govern without needing to be good, what exactly remains to prevent it from ruling forever?